In December of 1910, 4 Mounties walked onto the frozen Peel River and into one of the worst deaths the Canadian North has ever recorded. Inspector Francis Fitzgerald and his men carried 15 dogs, 3 sleds, and a full month of food. They were trained, tough, and backed by the most respected police force on the continent. 3 months later, a search party found them frozen in the snow, about 40 kilometers from safety, after they had eaten their own sled dogs. The cold gets the blame, but the real killer was a gap in their kit. This story does not start in 1910. It starts with a question the force had been answering since its first day in the saddle. How do you keep a man alive in a place that wants him dead? The answer was a kit, and almost none of it came from a British Army manual. It was borrowed piece by piece from the people who had already survived this land for thousands of years. 7 tools. Most are forgotten now. Every one of them stood between a constable and a name carved on a grave marker. The first tool weighed as much as a small child, the buffalo coat. When the Northwest Mounted Police marched west in 1874, 275 men crossed 2,500 kilometers of open prairie. The standard winter issue was a coat cut from a single bison hide. It weighed around 35 pounds. On a still day at 40 below, it was the only thing between a constable and freezing to death in the saddle. The force loved that coat so much that the buffalo head still sits on the badge of the modern RCMP. But the coat carried a fatal flaw that could kill you. Soaked through, it grew heavier and stopped holding heat. A man who broke through river ice in a wet buffalo coat was hauling his own coffin on his shoulders. A warm man who could not move was still a dead man, and that is what the second tool fixed. Snowshoes. Tool number 2 looks almost gentle now, but in deep northern snow, a man on foot sinks to his waist and burns through his strength in an hour. On a good pair, he rides on top of it and covers 30 kilometers in a day. The frames were bent wood. The webbing was strips of rawhide knotted into a mesh that held a man's weight without clogging. It was the engine of every winter patrol the force ever ran. Lose a snowshoe deep in the backcountry and your speed drops to a crawl, which in a race against starvation is the same as a death sentence. Learning to walk, turn, and climb on them took weeks. Today, it is a weekend hobby. Covering 30 kilometers a day, on those frames burned a brutal number of calories, and the third tool is what paid that bill. It also fed the entire frontier, and hardly anyone alive today has tasted it. Pemmican. Dried meat, pounded to powder and mixed with an equal weight of rendered fat, sometimes a handful of crushed berries, and nothing else. The Cree word it comes from translates roughly to manufactured grease, which tells you what eating it was like. A single pound carried close to 4,000 calories and kept for months without spoiling. The fur trade ran on it. Polar explorers hauled it to the edge of the world. The mounted police lived on it for weeks at a stretch, sewn into rawhide bags weighing 100 pounds each. Fitzgerald's patrol carried it too, and the day it ran out was the day the dying started. Remember the rawhide webbing lacing those snowshoes together? That was the fourth tool, hiding in plain sight. Babiche. Rawhide cut into thin, wet strips that dried hard as cord. A roll of babiche was the duct tape of the North. You laced your snowshoes with it, lashed a cracked sled together with it, stitched a torn dog harness, and when the pemmican was gone and the dogs were gone, you pulled a length loose and set a snare for a rabbit or a ptarmigan. One material, a dozen jobs, and you could cut more from any animal you killed. The mounted police learned this from the Indigenous and Métis travelers who had been turning a kill into cord, rope, and food for generations. Today, the skill of cutting and curing it has all but disappeared. If a forgotten kit that kept men alive at 60 below is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe. This channel digs into the buried technology of survival every week. The next tool decided whether a wet man lived through the night. Fire. And it was never as simple as striking a match. Every traveler carried a fire bag, a small pouch holding flint, a curved steel striker, and dry tinder kept far from the damp. In Fitzgerald's own diary, you can read how it worked under pressure. Again and again his men broke through river ice, soaked a foot, and had to stop right there and build a fire before the cold took the limb. Because without that fire, a frozen foot meant a man who could no longer walk. And a man who could not walk in the open Arctic was as good as gone. Striking a spark with frozen fingers, in wind, onto tinder that had to stay bone dry, was a skill men drilled until it was reflex. The sixth tool was worn around the waist, and the men who relied on it barely gave it a thought. The arrow sash, the cincture fleshy. It was a finger-woven wool belt almost 3 meters long, carried by the voyageurs and the Métis, guides the Mounties leaned on in the field. Worn tight, it held a coat shut and trapped body heat. Unwound, it became a tow rope for dragging a sled. Slung across the forehead, it turned into a tump line so a man could haul a crushing load without wrecking his back. In an emergency, it became a tourniquet over a bleeding wound, and the threads pulled from its fringe served as sewing thread for field repairs. Rope, harness, first aid, and a sewing kit, all in something a man simply tied on each morning. Which brings us to the last tool, the one the Lost Patrol was actually missing. It seemed small at the time. It wasn't. The seventh tool was not a tool at all. It was a person, and the knowledge carried inside their head. Fitzgerald's patrol had a buffalo coat, snowshoes, pemmican, babiche, and fire. What they lacked was a guide who truly knew the route. Their special constable, Sam Carter, had made the trip once and convinced everyone he could find the way again. He could not. The patrol burned 9 days lost in the Richardson Mountains, searching for a single creek, and those 9 days were the ones that killed them. When the relief party finally caught up, they found Fitzgerald's body roughly 40 kilometers from Fort McPherson, a half-day's walk from a warm stove. After it was over, the force rewrote its rules. Every northern patrol from then on would hire an indigenous guide who knew the land in their bones. They marked the trail. They built food caches along it. They had learned that the most important survival tool the Mounties ever carried was a map that lived inside someone else's mind. So picture it one more time. December 1910. 4 men step onto the ice carrying everything the manual told them to bring, and 3 months later, they lie frozen in the snow, a half day from help. Everything in their packs was sound. What failed them was the one tool that never shipped in a crate, the knowledge of a land that had kept people alive for thousands of years. If you want the next piece of forgotten Canadian survival technology, that history quietly buried, there's a full breakdown waiting in the linked video. Go watch it.